Well, thank you for the introduction, Mike. That's the nicest thing Mike said about me for a long time. He said a lot of other things. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to come back and talk to you. I'm sure those of you who are regular attenders are getting sick of seeing me, so hopefully this is my last time for a while, for your sake. And also, given the time limit, given particularly Michael's instructions and threats, with your indulgence, I'll read my script rather than talk to it, otherwise I tend to go on forever. So, I've been asked to talk to you about the artillery at Menin Road. The official historian of Australia in the Great War, Dr. Charles Bean, has dominated the Australian interpretation of that titanic struggle for more than 80 years. To challenge his version of why things happened is a very brave step for anyone, historian or not. However, his volume dealing with the events of 1917 has been criticised as being one of his weakest works. There are many explanations offered for this. He was ill for much of the year, he was certainly chronically overworked, and he had not become as emotionally engaged with the key Australian participants in the battles of 1917 as he did in those on the years on either side. However, there's another less charitable explanation that has its foundation in the very nature of battle in 1917. Bean was an unapologetic fan of the Australian infantryman, his audacity, bravery and determination. Yet as 1917 showed on far too many occasions, none of these characteristics were sufficient on their own to win the battle. By 1917, this war had become the artillery's war. Perhaps it always had been. Artillery killed more than all the other weapons combined, the figure usually quoted as 56% of all the casualties in World War I. However, by 1917, even the most one-eyed infantry general would not think of planning an attack without first consulting his artillery commander. Artillery now decided the outcome, and this technological face of battle did not fit Bean's paradigm. It was the artillery, not the infantry, that by now was winning the war, and the battles of 1917, in Passchendaele particularly, were the inescapable evidence of this new battlefield truth. Artillery's dominance of the battlefield did not occur by mischance. Yes, there were factors such as the largely static nature of much of the war, especially the middle years, that contributed, but there are other, arguably more important developments, often the work of the gunners and the gun makers themselves, that made artillery the true war-winning system it became. Improvements in the sciences of physics, chemistry and metallurgy enable gun makers, and this is the sole reason I put this in, is the excuse to put that up. That's an 18-inch railway gun. That's really going to get your attention. To design and build much heavier and more accurate guns and shells. New roles and tasks were added, including long-range interdiction, counterbattery fire and anti-aircraft responsibilities. New techniques involving new skills. Indirect fire, for example, meant learning how to deal with observers in aircraft and balloons. That's an RE-8, artillery observation aircraft. Accurate indirect fire meant factoring in, I shouldn't be telling this to this audience, extraordinary numbers of variables such as weather conditions, barrel wear, ammunition temperature, putting all that into your fire solution calculations. As well, the traditional, quote, support for the infantry role had become immeasurably more complex in implementation. New organisations, new doctrine and new tactics had to be developed to take advantage of these new developments. The introduction in significant numbers of new types of artillery meant artillery doctrine was a fast evolving process, while at the other end of the adaptation requirement, the introduction of very heavy guns demanded innovative methods of all sorts of things, including basic factors such as being able to move them. Modern artillery transport in 1917. Apart from the new roles already mentioned, artillery planners had to learn to cooperate with new players in the barrage role, mortars and machine guns being the most obvious. By 1917, neither the fire support role, nor indeed many of the more capable weapons that provided it, looked much like the 1914 equivalent. Some changes, of course, did not always help improve the artillery's somewhat complex relationship with its principal client, the infantry. The Somme experience of the power of Allied artillery had forced the Germans to devise new defensive methods. These were based not on a hard crust of formal defence, but on defence in depth, with heavy and accurate defensive artillery barrages providing the main defence against the enemy advance, and infantry counter-attack formations held well to the rear to come forward and recover lost ground. British artillery planners recognised the implications of these changes, then gave higher priority to specialised counterbattery capabilities, for example, and to long-range interdiction of the rear areas to prevent the forward movement of these counter-attack divisions. Direct support for the front line was still provided, of course, especially when the attack was underway, but priority for heavy artillery particularly was no longer determined by the assaulting infantry. The war diaries, however, suggest that the attacking infantry, when held up by a difficult enemy strongpoint, did not understand or perhaps appreciate the subtleties of this new doctrine. Probably this is a pillbox in 1917 on Westhoek Ridge. Did not understand the subtleties of this new doctrine, and they probably cursed the gunners for not solving their immediate problem more than eulogising them for their contribution to overall victory. Nonetheless, it is incontestable that these new tactics led directly to British artillery domination of the 1918 battlefield, and if you were looking for a single example of how new doctrine and training, technological method developments, organisational sophistication and new tactics were both evolving and combining with hard-won expertise in the tactical fire plan support planning to produce a near-perfect example of artillery support for a major attack, which is a very long sentence, the Battle of Menin Road is probably hard to go past. Before discussing the battle itself, however, I must explain one major organisational change made in 1917 that continues to confuse many in their understanding of how the artillery was organised in 1917. Field artillery was traditionally an organic arm of its parent infantry division. Oops, missed one. That's just Menin Road, the view of Menin Road. Which meant that when the division rotated out of the front line, it took its artillery with it. The inefficiency of this arrangement was recognised in early 1917, and artillery underwent its last major organisational restructuring of the war. Infantry divisional artillery was reduced from the 3 18-pounder and 1 4.2-inch howitzer brigades that you see in this slide to 2 field brigades, each consisting of 3 batteries of 18-pounders and 1 battery of 4.5-inch howitzers. The remaining guns were organised into Army field brigades and became a strategic reserve for use anywhere extra support was required within the disposition of the Army or Corps. In addition, it became common for divisions to leave their artillery in situ when they rotated out of the front line. Thus, just because the 1st Field Artillery Brigade War Diary reports being in action, it does not automatically follow that the 1st Infantry Division was also in action. Greater flexibility was also introduced for the heavy artillery, and this comes into play particularly in time for the Passchendaele campaign, by adopting a somewhat utilitarian method of tactically grouping batteries together for specific purposes in specific operations. Heavy artillery had traditionally, such as it was, been managed at the battery organisational level in 1916. They had begun to be grouped into, in 1916, they had begun to be grouped into larger force elements called heavy artillery groups. These groups could contain weapons of widely different calibres and mobility. 12-inch railway guns and wheeled 6-inch howitzers, for example, were frequently combined, and were held at the Corps or Army level to be allocated on a needs basis for the specific operation. The Army commanded field artillery brigades also would often be split and combined into groups with medium and heavy howitzers and different calibre mortars. The rather utilitarian description of these temporary blocks of massive firepower, and you'll find them in the war diaries everywhere, is usually simply the right, centre and left bombardment group, with another group designated as the Counterbattery group. There are 4 slides, which will follow the next one, which will illustrate the size and organisation of the bombardment groups supporting Menin Road. However, before we get to that, and for an audience like this, it's important to remind you that first, as I said earlier, that some elements in the bombardment plan, there were some other elements in the bombardment plan. As mentioned, mortars and machine guns were also introduced into the artillery effort, with barrages by the divisional machine guns, up to 64 Vickers machine guns at any one time, complementing and expanding the traditional artillery barrage. This is the diagram for how a barrage was shown. It's separate from a map. I'll draw your attention to the yellow dots at the bottom left hand of the screen. These show the machine gun contribution. The dots, as you can do when you learn how to interpret this, the dots indicate the machine guns were to commence their barrage at 0 hour, firing 500 yards in front of the start line. At 0 plus 3 minutes, they were to extend their range, that is lift 100 yards for another 3 minutes, and then so on. And as you can see, progressively, as it goes up to the right, it's extending the range out. There were also enough mortars in the barrage plan to get the defenders' attention. 16 heavy, 9.45-inch, and usually about 12 medium, that is 6-inch Newton mortars, were operated by each division's heavy and medium artillery batteries. These were operated by gunners, functioned as artillery, and were integrated into the fire control plan by the artillery planners. Contrast this with the 48 light trench mortars that remained an infantry weapon, but when available could also be given roles in the planned barrage. However, their primary role was, as always, when advancing with the assaulting infantry to provide immediate local support. At Menin Road, the large number of artillery brigades available meant, given the time I skipped over it, but the Planning General for Menin Road, General Plumer, is the architect of the British tactic called bite and hold. And he understands that to bite and hold in this particular environment, particularly on the Gellerveld Plateau, which is the target that Menin Road sits on, and the British Fifth Army had tried twice to capture it and failed, he needs artillery. And the nub of his plan, as I'll say in a second, is artillery. It's important to remember that the large number of artillery brigades meant that for each of the two corps in the Second Army attack, rather than being organised into what I mentioned earlier, the standard 3 single groups, they now combine them in actually 2 groups. But each group is now a double bombardment group, and you'll see the significance of this in a minute. As I promised, there's the first. That's the left bombardment group, or the northerly bombardment group. Remember, these assets are supporting just 2 divisions. These are supporting 1st Anzac. There are a lot of others that I'll explain in a minute. So that's your left bombardment group. There's some interesting stuff in there. I particularly like the Royal Marine 15-inch howitzer. There's the right bombardment group. Nothing quite so spectacular on that. I hope you're keeping count of the number of barrels is a little imprecise because the Royal Garrison Artillery is in the process of changing over from 4-gun to 6-gun batteries in the 6-inch howitzers at this stage, and it's a little difficult to plot which ones had how many at this stage. There's your northern counterbattery group. This is specifically dedicated to counterbattering German artillery. And there's your southern counterbattery group. Plus, they even have a spare heavy artillery group. Right. The Battle of Menin Road started at 0540 on the 20th September 1917. And in another, 2 and a bit months, it'll be 100 years. For most of the assaulting infantry, it lasted less than 5 hours. For those taking the first objective, the red line, which is not shown on that map, because it was too close, it took less than an hour. And most of that was spent waiting for the guns. However, to fully understand what's been achieved at Menin Road, some context is necessary. Menin Road was the 3rd of 8 major battles in the Passchendaele operation. There were numerous smaller ones as well. The Passchendaele campaign ranks just behind the Somme for the volume of emotion, misunderstanding and rancour it generates amongst historians and non-historians alike. I don't have time to go through all the arguments about the strategic justification for the campaign or the implementation of it. However, in summary, Passchendaele was launched for 2 basic reasons. To drive the Germans out of Western Belgium and clear their submarines away from their bases on the Belgian coast, because they're at the point of starving Britain, and to keep German attention away from the French army, which at this stage, at least the British believed, was on the point of disintegration, although I'm getting a waving from our resident French army expert who says they're rubbish. But the British actually thought that, and that's actually in Haig's directive. Right. Well, yeah, okay. Right, where was I? No, you're right.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Initial planning for the attack was to be conducted by the British. Initial planning was for the attack to be conducted by the British Fifth Army under General Sir Hubert Gough. He's the rather short chap facing the camera there. Gough had a reputation as being something of a thruster, and Haig, the Commander-in-Chief, wanted the attack prosecuted with some vigour. The plan was innovative and comprehensive. There was even an amphibious landing, Operation Hush, planned to land a division behind the German lines on the Belgian coast. Unfortunately, there are also a number of errors in the plan, the main flaw being an overly optimistic assumption about the ease with which the dominating high ground in the area of operation, the Gellerveld Plateau, could be cleared. Gough launched his first attack, the Battle of Pilcombe Ridge. This map shows it in 2 parts. You've got to take the right-hand one and stick it on the top, because it didn't fit. This is the British Fifth Army. You can see this is not a small attack. There are about 8 divisions involved in this attack. It made good progress, but the Gellerveld Plateau on its southern flank, and that's, you can see where the large 2 is, and there's a boundary line. That's sort of approximately where it's running along there and up to just south of Hooger. Sorry, up to Hooger and including Hooger, and up to Westhoek. So yeah, it's mostly all on that map. Having an exposed right flank severely limited the Fifth Army's ability to keep advancing, nor did the miserable weather help. The attack ground to a halt, with some progress made, but nothing like the depth of penetration planned. A series of small efforts was then subsequently made to try and capture the plateau, while the main attack further north paused and consolidated captured ground. Haig, under considerable political, Allied military and timing pressures, pressed Gough to recommence the main attack as soon as possible, even if the Gellivelt Plateau remained in enemy's hands. Consequently, a second major attack, the Battle of Langemarck, was launched on the 16th of August. Same thing, and the French are involved here. The French First Army is right on the northern flank of this attack. It also made some progress, but again, the southern flank held it back. Haig lost patience with Gough, and in late August brought in the British Second Army under General Sir Herbert Plumer, on the southern flank of the Fifth Army, which shifted north to accommodate the new forces. His task was specifically to take the Gellivelt and free up Fifth Army to press on with the main attack. And that's Plumer with the walrus moustache. The plan Plumer devised to capture the plateau was similar in concept to the one they'd taken to Messines. He proposed a four-stage, step-by-step attack with strictly limited depths of advance, 1,500 metres maximum for each attack, and a 6-day pause between each phase of the attack. During the pause, while the infantry consolidated the captured positions, ready to repel German counterattack, half of the artillery assets would then be moved forward to provide the additional range necessary to support the next attack. Contrary to widespread British and French thinking at the time on offensive tactics, each attack would be on a comparatively narrow frontage. The frontage for Plumer's Menin Road attack was essentially the same as that attacked on the 31st of July by 2nd Corps, and 2nd Corps had attacked with 2 divisions. The same frontage now would be attacked by 4, ensuring that there would be sufficient combat mass to make both the advance and then to secure any advances from counterattack. This is where the Australians, the artillery and Menin Road all come together. Plumer, knowing the challenge of Gellivelt, because he'd been there for some time on the southern flank of Fifth Army, had demanded significant reinforcement of his Second Army. It had been heavily stripped of combat assets in June to build up Fifth Army for the main attack. The Australian infantry of 1st Anzac Corps, who were to mount part of the Menin Road attack, were resting and refitting in BEF reserve, and Plumer requested them as replacements for his worn-out 2nd Corps. As 2nd Anzac was already in 2nd Army, this brought together all the Australian divisions on the Western Front for the first time. Menin Road was the first major battle of 2nd Army's involvement in the Passchendaele operation, noting that it had been conducting operations in support of 5th Army's attempt to capture the plateau in July and August. I need to make another important aside here. We Australians tend to think that Menin Road was an Australian battle, and given 1st and 2nd Australian divisions were involved, it was. What many forget, though, is it was not just an Australian battle. The battle called Menin Road involved 3 corps from the 5th Army, which attacked on the same time as the 2nd Army, and in 2nd Army the main effort was by 1 Anzac and 10th Corps, while on the right flank of 10th Corps, 9th Corps also attacked. In all, 10 infantry divisions advanced on the 20th of September, of which only 2 were Australian. The key point about Plumer's plan for the Menin Road attack was, as I said earlier, every aspect of it was subordinate to the artillery plan. As well as infantry reinforcement, 2nd Army's artillery assets were greatly increased. A large number of artillery units were transferred from the British 4th Army, including 3 Australian Army infantry brigades of field artillery and the addition of the 22nd and the 54th Heavy Artillery Groups. Other brigades came from Army Reserve. All the artillery of all the corps and divisions in 2nd Army, including those in reserve and resting, were to support the initial attack, which meant when 1st Anzac attacks, it has in support 9 field artillery brigades, that's 324 80-pounder field guns, and 108 4.5-inch howitzers in direct support. In addition, other field batteries, plus the medium and heavy guns shown earlier, conducted the broader bombardment and augmented the barrage fire support. Plumer had assembled over 3.2 million shells of all calibres to support this attack. He seriously wanted it to work. Between 1914 and 1917, planning artillery fire support had become immeasurably more complex. Gone were simple linear barrages. What have I missed over? Sorry. Gone were simple linear barrages initiated by infantry commanders. Barrages now could be offensive, defensive, rolling, lifting, box, interdicting, or even feints. And all of these could be programmed during an attack, and many of them were used during this attack. The capability of specific gun types was closely matched to tasks. That's a Royal Marine artillery 15-inch howitzer. Long-range guns tended to be used for long-range interdiction and counterbattery, and were not used, as in 16, merely to add weight to short-range barrages. Heavy howitzers were used to attempt to destroy pillboxes and strong points, while the lighter 4.5-inch howitzers, for example, became skilled at suppressive fire. Okay. That's the fire plan just for the first ANZAC for Menin Road. The fire plan just for the support of the Australian attack Menin Road was a complex and two-phased affair. The first was a sporadic barrage of variable weight in the 5 days preceding the attack. While firing a heavy barrage to maximise the effect was desirable, such a tactic also warned the enemy that the infantry assault was imminent. Consequently, while the preliminary bombardment was very heavy, intended as it was to locate and destroy German artillery and as many German fixed defences, like pillboxes and trench strongpoints, as possible, it was done in a manner, and I quote the War Diary, that appeared routine. I don't quite know how over 1,000 barrels of 6-inch or larger could be made to look routine, but that's in fact what the artillery orders demanded. More emphasis was placed, however, on accuracy than weight or rate of fire, which is quite a change from 1916. The fire support phase for the attack itself was based on an innovative new approach for the barrage. Given the nature of the enemy's deep and interlocking defences on the Gallivelt Plateau, there was little purpose in having a single, relatively thin line of shells rolling just in front of the advancing infantry, as they tried in 1916 on the Somme. This barrage was certainly not a single line of shells. It was a storm of shells 1,000 yards deep, comprising 5 separate lines, 4 separated by 200 yards, while the interval between lines 4 and 5 was only 100 yards. I don't understand how you can distinguish a 15-inch shell and get it onto a 100-yard line with precision, but that's what the fire plans demanded. The line closest to the attacking infantry was laid down by the 18-pounder field guns a mere 150 yards in front of the infantry forming up position. The outposts were withdrawn in some sort of acknowledgement of the hazard that they were facing. The second line was by 18-pounders together with 4.5-inch howitzers. The next 3 were fired by combinations of machine guns, 6-inch, 8-inch and 9.2-inch howitzers. The barrage would not commence until the assault troops had begun to form up in no man's land, trying to achieve a small element of tactical surprise. At 0 hour, it rested in front of the start line for 3 minutes before it began to roll forward at a specified rate. Initially, this was 100 yards in 4 minutes for the first 200 yards, then slowed to 100 yards in 6 minutes. Although the Australian infantry would later complain that the rate of advance was too slow, it was based on the bitter experiences of the Somme the year before, where once you were separated from the barrage, entire battalions were destroyed. Yep, I'm getting close to finishing. Where am I? It would pause for an hour just past the first objective, the red line, to enable the infantry to consolidate their initial gains. That's another diagrammatic. You can see how the barrage range is the X axis and Y is the timing. Look at the other way around. X is the timing, Y is the range. You can see how the barrage goes out and comes back to a fixed plan. It would then roll forward again at an even slower rate of 100 yards in 8 minutes to the second objective, the blue line, and beyond it. And after yet another 2-hour-long pause beyond the second objective, it then rolls forward to the green line at 100 yards in 8 minutes again. The infantry advanced as close beyond the barrage as possible so that when it lifted, they could immediately engage the objective before the defenders had recovered. Within this general arrangement, the heavy howitzers engaged specific targets. It's not very clear, but it's an image from the War Diary. The circles show you the different calibre of guns and the areas in which they were free. The War Diary uses the term roam, in which they were free to roam within the specific fire plan. I've probably just said that then. However, the artillery continued also. Yes, okay. In all, the barrage at Menin Road lasted for 8 hours and 8 minutes, while the infantry consolidated on the third objective after 5 hours. However, the artillery also continued to provide protection past that 8-hour time, mainly through 3 pre-planned barrages on specific areas when called for by infantry SOS signals or when spotting aircraft that detected enemy build-up. As you can see, the gunners were very busy. The fire support plan at Menin Road was an outstanding success. Without it, the outcome of the battle would likely have been very different. Ending where I started, however, I can understand to some extent Charles Bean's reaction to warfare as it was now being conducted. While the infantry still had hard fights to face in the broken ground of the Gallivelt Plateau, and while they still won plenty of Victoria Crosses for acts of outstanding valour, The work of actually killing the Germans in sufficient numbers to enable the infantry to move forward at all was done largely by the gunners. No gunners won a VC at Passchendaele, even though they worked immeasurably harder and longer than their infantry colleagues, and even though the Germans' frightful new weapon of mustard gas was used for the first time specifically on Allied artillery. Reading Bean, I felt he felt almost repelled by the disembodied feel of indirect killing. I found myself wondering, though, what he would have made then of the modern battlefield, where even more remote killing by semi-autonomous drones has become the norm. Thank you.